Sudakshina Unnikrishnan of Barclays Capital. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Now, can you put this ban into context for us? How unusual is this move historically?
Well, it's unusual in the sense that, you'd seen wheat prices being fairly lackluster at the start of this year, and at current prices at over $7 a bushel are well above the sort of historical norm for prices. So in that sense, it is an unusual move, and prices have also reacted very rapidly. It's only been over the course of the last few weeks that we've seen prices climbing very, very sharply. So in that sense, it's unusual. But if you compare it to the sort of last bout where we saw inflationary concerns being stoked, when we saw a lot of talk regarding a food crisis, when we go back to 2007, 2008, then the current situation is quite different. Inventory levels are quite a bit more comfortable than they were then. The US, which is the world's largest producer for a whole number of grains, is having a fairly good harvest. And overall, export levels are unlikely to go back to the sort of levels that we had in that period. So despite the sort of problems that has surfaced in the FSU countries, we are seeing that in the US, in other producing countries like Argentina, Australia, the harvest looks fairly healthy and exports should, go on as usual, albeit in a slightly tighter environment.
Is there a concern that there is too much reliance on Russia? Now there's almost 30% of the world's grain coming out of the kind of Black Sea states. Is that a worry when it seems like the harvests there are quite volatile?
Well, the thing about agricultural commodities is that, weather tends to be an eternal wild card across these markets. So in that sense, if it weren't for that sort of 26% coming from the FSU countries, then that level of production would be coming from somewhere else. And weather conditions have been very volatile globally for the last few years. If you go back to the 07-08 period when we saw the grain crisis, then we actually saw flooding in parts of the US Midwest. We saw the drought for 2 consecutive years in Australia. So no region really so far has been immune in terms of weather conditions. So this sort of reliance, if it weren't on Russia, would be on any other country, which would then be as sort of vulnerable to weather problems as Russia has been now.
Now, we are going to see increased wheat prices, presumably. What kind of knock-on effect is that going to have for consumers and for inflation generally?
Yes, in that sense, higher wheat prices would need to stay at elevated levels for at least a few months to be able to see some sort of feed-through effect onto grocery bills, onto inflationary expectations. So if prices were to sort of stabilize at current levels and maybe start edging lower, then in that sense this would be viewed very much as a sort of blip in terms of normal pricing levels. But if prices continue to stay at this level and climb higher on a sustained sort of basis for at least a few months, then I think that would have some strong implications in terms of inflationary expectations. Not as strong as we had 2 years ago, because that's when you saw corn prices, soybean prices hitting all-time high as well. But it would certainly mean that sort of the prices being paid by consumers for everything ranging from wheat or flour products to bread would be higher than they have been, at least for the last 2 years.
Okay, Sudakshina Unnikrishnan from Barclays Capital, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.